Welcome to the Public Figure Society podcast, where innovation meets influence. If you're building a brand, leading a movement, or shaping the future, you are in the right place. We bring you the insights, strategies, and stories that fuel the world's most impactful public figures. It is time to step up, stand out, and leave your mark. Let's dive in. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have Mike Klein. I have known him for 8 years. He is a fellow communicator, or Stratcomer as we call ourselves. He's the editor-in-chief of Strategic Magazine, and he has lived in Iceland for 4 years, and he is the most influential person from Iceland as termed by LinkedIn. And I want to say welcome, Mike. How are you?
It's good to be here, Torrin. Thank you very much for having me.
So, things are changing in our profession, and I would love to hear. You wrote a book on social communications and have kind of put your ear to the ground on where things are going, trends and so forth, and successfully put yourself as one of the number one influencer from Iceland on LinkedIn. Where are you seeing the world is now, and where do you think it's going to be going?
Well, I think the world is going from a state of kind of smug complacency, which kind of, and certainly in the communications world, but also in generally, from the end of COVID until the beginning of 2025. There was this general view that things were going to continue as they were, and it's actually something that in the communications profession that manifested itself as kind of a de-skilling, de-scoping, and de-rating of strategic communicators in general, and particularly strategic communication roles in organizations. The idea of we don't necessarily need a heavyweight in this type of role. We can get somebody junior who's social media savvy, and we can even have AI do a lot of the content. Now, in a world where things are predictable, that kind of approach, it's not great, but you can probably minimize any damage from it. In a world which we're seeing now, where assumptions are a bit less reliable. Activities in, both in the commercial and political world are more unpredictable, and where there's a need for greater skill and awareness and perceptiveness. Um, there's a huge opportunity for people in my field, and particularly people who are experts in my field, to get these conversations back onto the subject of why you need people who know what they're doing to help you navigate the disruption that's taking place in the world. And it's not an accident that the podcast that I co-host with my podcast partner, Janet Hitchin, is called the Navigating Disruption Podcast.
Right. That's so interesting. Fascinating. I actually have a lot of people saying that we are obsolete in this. I have had some top leaders in the social media sphere saying that public relations, strategic communications is not as necessary because you can do it yourself. You have the AI taking over a lot. But what you're saying is that that's not really true.
The idea that strategic communication has become a do-it-yourself proposition because there are tools available to harvest and distribute your thoughts or one's thoughts is kind of like saying that airline pilotry is obsolete because you can get the keys to an airplane and get it down a runway. You can't necessarily get it off the runway. You don't necessarily have the skills or the experience to avoid a flaming crash, but you can certainly go in and start one if you really want to. Now, the challenge in the current environment is that credibility is everything. Now, overly scripting what people say may indeed be obsolete, but being really clear about what the risks and what the opportunities are in terms of any set of messaging encountering any specific audience continues to be a huge issue. And, you have a lot of leaders out there who have downscaled or, deep six their comms functions who've really stepped in it.
Can you give me an
They've
example on
made,
that? Can you give an
what's
example?
that?
Can you give an example on that?
Um, there's so many of them that it's hard to come up with anything that's particularly obvious. Um, I'll need to come back with you on. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, some of the things that Elon Musk has been doing, in his private companies and in his government capacity, have, caused certain public relations problems. Like the way he's fired people, like the way he's done performance management, both in terms of the tone, the distribution, the security, and all of that. I mean, he's the most obvious choice, but I obviously don't want to focus on him in
No.
particular because it's a much bigger phenomenon. People, particularly leaders, communicating directly without any sensitivity. There's like lots of videos about the return to offices. There's this one great one where you had a bunch of people doing the chicken dance and saying, not only are we asking you to come to the office, we're telling you to come to the office. And unless they were trying to use that as a soft layoff program, trying to use that as a way to get rid of people without paying severance, which if that was their cause, then their desired outcome, then that might have been an actual success. But by and large, most organizations aren't trying to deliberately antagonize people. And if you don't have a strategic communication filter, you could spend a lot of you could save a very small amount of money and do a lot of damage by deliberately antagonizing or inadvertently antagonizing a large segment of your customers, or at least the public upon which the goodwill of which you depend.
Wow. Yeah. It's very, very interesting you're saying that. So, how do you feel that with this disruption then, one thing that we can't really delegate, as I'm learning from you, is strategy and the profession itself on how we have learned how to do strategy. Um, but it seems like, and I love this expression we have in Norway. We call it, "Oh, it's so Texas there," which means that it's like so disruptive. It's such a revolution that how do we actually navigate in this world of this and having people feel like that what we're doing is not really necessary.
Well, first of all, it's not Texas just in Texas. It's Texas everywhere because what's happening in one geography has knock-on effects in others.
Right.
So, if organizations in the United States are seeing the current change in cultural tone and the kind of unreliability of previous assumptions based on what's been happening politically in the U.S. Many companies are international. A fair number of companies are global. Um, you've got some issues like, for example, around DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion, where if the standards are changing in the US, do they have to change elsewhere? If you're a German company or a British company, which operates in a different political environment, do you have to harmonize to the US standard, or to what extent do you have to hold true to your global standards and navigate through the disruptions on this in the US? That's an obvious example, but it's also an indicative example. Um, the other side of that is that, there's the classic line, somebody who is their own lawyer has a fool for a client. And I think that's just as true from a strategic communication perspective. And it's not because strategic communication people have divinely endowed gifts in this area. But the whole purpose of being a communication strategist is to be able to take an idea, look at it from 3,000, 35,000 feet, and see what's the pathway to turn that idea into an outcome. If you're at ground level, you don't see those pathways. You might see openings, but you don't really see the pathway further out, and you don't see the pitfalls that are along the way. Now, some people do it on pure bluster and bravado. Some people have been able to um, have a win streak with a lucky hand, or have unlimited resources to be able to absorb all of their failures and not have to worry that much about the risks entailed in getting this wrong. But most organizations, particularly organizations that are owned by shareholders, have a lot to worry about in terms of risk and reputation, because they're the people who own those shares have things to worry about. Like if you're from Norway, the biggest shareholder in the world, or one of the biggest shareholders in the world, is the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway. And they can encounter serious risk if the shares that they own are tied to stocks that are unpopular in Norway.
Right.
And if they get spooked and dump a bunch of shares, that's going to have impact on the share price globally. So even if you want to, if you think you're an island and you want to do things your own way, there are considerations that you either have to think about or you have to deal with if you haven't thought about.
Right. But this is really fascinating. But do you think in the age of Trump, and that's what I really think, what I really liked when I was talking about Trump when he came on the stage in 2016, I read an article in the Washington Post talking about we are now in the worldwide wrestling message of communications, right? It's all like fake news back and forth. We don't know what's going on. It's like all this mayhem. And that with that, before that, it was kind of like chess. Right now, there's so many different strategies that are playing into the field. And it seems like some people are saying that cancel culture doesn't really matter anymore. What are your feelings to that? Is kind of the profession that we're talking about, the strategic communications, right time, right place, right moment, helping out with that, helping with going viral, making sure you're managing that, making sure you're managing cancel culture. Is that something that's not as necessary in the age of Trump communication?
I think it's even more necessary if your profitability and stability is dependent upon a group of people which has its own communication ecosystem. So all employees in an organization are part of an organization's communication ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's not just simply what's happening on X or what's happening on Instagram. It's, to what extent are the messages that the organization is putting out aligned with the reality that's being experienced on a day-to-day basis, both in terms of the conversation that employees are having with each other and the conversation that employees are having with their stakeholders.
So,
So,
okay. So,
you that's and my core skill these days, my core area of interest is employee communication, even though my background is political communication. So, in the realm of employee communication, where you've got a group of people that A, are economically dependent on what's going on in this ecosystem, and B, the ecosystem has a boundary around it called being an employee or being a working stakeholder, which includes, say, contractors and others who are part of the production and delivery process. That boundary actually isn't just simply a line. It's actually a wall, in much the same way as a squash court or a racquetball court has walls that things reverberate off of. So in that within that wall there is pressure that builds. that people are very sensitive to. And if a CEO makes some flippant comment about, you know, the state of the industry or the state of the company or, the state of the economy, people get nervous, they get tentative, they either start looking for alternative employment, or they keep their heads down and disengage from active participation in anything other than their most basic tasks. And so, if you're not thinking about communication from that perspective as a leader in an organization, you may end up neutralizing the value of your organization.
Okay, so what I'm surmising from you is that having a strategic communications person is more important for companies of a certain size than it is really for an individual person and per se. They're not going to be considering possibly investing in that until maybe some problems are happening. That's usually when we come on board, is when it's crisis and reputation issues. And
Right.
so,
I haven't done communication for individuals other than, dabbling in politics in the last 30 years. So I'm not an expert on, I'm not a publicist.
right,
I'm not somebody who is trying to navigate a person towards media coverage or towards, you know, aware, I'm not trying to improve somebody else's level of desirability or influence
right,
as an individual.
right,
So I can't speak to that. But if you're talking about being a leader of some entity that has any complexity,
right.
you need to think about strategic communication about your entity and how it operates, as well as how your entity is perceived externally.
Okay. So that's fascinating because, like, I work quite a bit with individuals, and I work with solo entrepreneurs somewhat, and what I am seeing is, and this is kind of what my upcoming book is really about, is that we all have to think about ourselves in a public figure status, and somewhat what I'm seeing is that the strategic communications profession is needing to look at themselves more, or certain components of becoming more of a publicist, because the and what I mean by that is that we are no longer just a person. We are a person and a product. Like, a CEO is not just a person, it's a product. We look at him as a product to help build the business, right? His brand builds the business, his personal brand. So you look at him in his, not just as the CEO of the company, but what can he contribute to enrich the business? That's how, at least I'm thinking about it. And
Right.
in
And
that,
also the extent to which his behavior is consistent with the business's message.
right. And so that there's a component of people right now have to think of themselves as products, and businesses have to think of themselves as people, right? Because we're buying brands that can touch and feel and have an experience, which is really what a definition of a person is. So how I'm seeing is that, like Jim Stengel, who was the CMO of Procter and Gamble, who came with a fantastic book called Grow in the early 2000s, was really about how a company needs a purpose. It's like a company needs to be a person, right? And when we're fast forwarding today with all of this mayhem and craziness and navigating it, and like with your podcast, The Disruptor, it's kind of like we all have to look at ourselves as a person and a product. Like, how many followers do you have? How is your messaging making an impact? How does that build to the business? I don't know what you think about that.
Lines up a lot more with what I'm doing as Mike Klein as a public figure in the strategic communication industry.
Yeah,
It
you are.
lines up a lot more with that than the advice that I'm giving to leaders and organizations about how they need to navigate themselves through this disruption to get where they want to go. Now, in terms of what I do on an individual level, I've got a somewhat unique positioning in the organizational communication internal comm space, which is that I'm kind of seen as the contrarian. I'm also somebody who openly challenges some of the more dysfunctional cultural aspects of our profession. A lot of people who are particularly internal communication professionals are what a woman by the name of Tara McDonough, who's you know a true public figure in this space, calls communication waitresses, where they don't take accountability either of the product or of the outcome. They just do the work, and they do the work that they're asked to do. And there's a very pervasive mindset in our profession. And Tara and I have very different ways of challenging that. The way and you can talk with, and I would recommend that you talk with her. She'd make an excellent guest for
I
you.
would love that. So if you could
Um,
connect me, that'd be fantastic.
yes, but I mean, my approach is to basically, hold a mirror to the profession and say, look, you know, it's time for us to stop talking about needing a seat at the table and start looking at the extent to which we have a hand on the wheel. Because
I
it's
I want to
communication.
interrupt you there. I really like what you're saying there. The profession has kind of been outdated and I think even chief marketing officer when I was researching my book, really seeing, and I didn't put this in the book, but what I was really seeing is that the CMO position is getting less and less and less important. People are not utilizing that as much anymore, and you're seeing strategy officers coming in. So this is really about the placement of us, our role in the bigger corporations, which I would say is about $1 million and more in revenue. What do you think of that?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And I guess the key thing is that we who are communication leaders, and I use that term very specifically, people who are communication leaders, people who demonstrate initiative, and courage, and leadership in this day-to-day execution of our jobs, which we all do. Most of us don't own that, but it's something we all do in this space. In owning that, then we need to also be concerned about being seen as the people who do that. And it's not just about getting credits for credit's sake. It's not about ego gratification. It's about having enough of a public profile in the organization that people come to you to get their problem solved, to get positioned, to get protected. We actually, and the irony is that we can do this for people in organizations much more reliably and much more cheaply than nearly anything else you can do with money in an organization. You know,
Yeah, I agree with you that communication saves money, and communication saves money of what the advertising and budget of marketing wants to do. But if you're thinking
it
of your
also
client,
saves companies.
what'd you say?
It also saves companies. I mean, we
Yeah.
often go down the rabbit hole of trying to justify our work in terms of ROI. And we should do that, but we shouldn't dwell on it because, even if we make more than enough or make or save more than enough money to justify our salaries or even justify our salaries and a luxurious level of staffing underneath us, that pales in comparison to the fact that we help organizations avoid doing stupid things that could cost them billions.
Right. I think you're absolutely correct on that. So when you're looking at clients that you are serving, what kind of clients are you serving right now in Iceland? And is it mostly Iceland, or are you kind of serving all over the
Don't
country?
serve any Icelandic clients, and I like it that way to a certain extent because companies here tend to be small.
Okay.
And with the exception of a relatively small number of tech or tech focused companies, they're deeply embedded in the social and cultural infrastructure. You've got, kind of a duopoly in retail. You've got duopolies basically in every area of endeavor here,
Right.
and they're not going away. They have natural relationships with each other, and they don't really focus on external markets. And they're about 25 very good communicators here who service that market. And they don't, they're not people who really seek out a lot of external advice. Most of them are barely even on LinkedIn. And
Right.
so one of the reasons why it was easy for me to become the number one LinkedIn influencer in Iceland is that, unless you've got deep and active international connections, you don't need to be a LinkedIn influencer in Iceland. Everybody engages on Facebook or across a coffee shop table or,
That is
occasionally at
true.
one of the bars.
Facebook is like the number one place for Norwegian companies as well. So I totally get that. So and you've been in Iceland for 4 years. Where were you before that?
I was in Holland for 6 years, Denmark for two, well, Denmark and Holland, commuting for a couple of years. Um, Belgium before that, Holland before that, the US before that, the UK before that. And then before all of that, I managed political campaigns in the US for about 10 years professionally.
So let me ask you this. How did you get yourself to Europe as an American?
I went to business school at London Business School and stayed in London and managed to get a passport. And before the British public decided to hang itself by voting in Brexit, I had a lovely thing called a European Union passport that allowed me to live and work anywhere in Europe. And naturally, I'm still deeply pissed off that that's gone away.
Yes, I know. So, but with that in mind, how did you end up in Iceland then?
I met my lovely wife, Augustina, who was living in Copenhagen at the same time I was. And we met online and we connected fairly quickly. And I then lost my position at Maersk, got a position with a then Russian controlled mobile phone company based out of Amsterdam, worked for them for 4 years, commuted for two. And, after the first 2 years, she agreed to move to Holland and she set up a travel business in Holland for Iceland. And then when COVID hit, and the travel business went sideways, um, she had a teaching certificate. We looked around. I was doing work that I could do remotely, and we moved to Iceland. And she taught in the school system for few years before going full back time on her travel business.
That's fantastic. So, so what, let's. I just want to come to kind of close, but with you, what I love about what you're saying is that you really believe that strategic communication is more of a role right now because you got to be strategic in this the age of disruption. And with yourself, you've really been able to build a strong personal brand. You're a leader of strategic communications, which I think there's an organization out of Australia that you're part of. You have done the IABC. You've really been, and that's how I got to meet you because people were saying you're a leader that I need to talk to and I need to get to know. How have you been able to position your personal brand, and what advice would you give to someone that doesn't necessarily want to be out there every single day, doesn't want to be like the talking head on social media, but possibly want to have some influence? And that's kind of why I stepped away from becoming famous, because you don't have to be everywhere all the time out there. It's finding how do you create influence in the circles that you want to have influence in. And that is something you've been able to do it from looking from the outside in.
Well, I think there are a few generic things that people can do to make themselves more influential. The most important thing you can do to make yourself influential is to introduce people to each other. Because A, it's tangibly influential. They would not have met if you hadn't introduced them. So there's both a certain amount of spiritual satisfaction that you get from doing that. But when you introduce two people, you're not just creating a relationship with them, you're creating a relationship between each of them together and separately with you. So if you do this enough, you actually can create a network around you of people who you've done something good for. And this is something that you can do very tangibly, very intentionally. You can make a list of 50 people that you know. You can go on LinkedIn to see if they know each other. And then you can introduce the ones who make sense to introduce to each other. That alone increases your influence. Now, if you're trying to increase your influence in a sector or in an organization or in a community, focus on the people in that sector, organization, and community and do this. It's not being influential is not building the spiritual aura that people get attracted to. It's intervening in the right way and at the right time. Really in the right way, because if you do it in the right way, any time is the right time. And I've introduced you to people, you've introduced me to people. So,
Yeah,
I mean, we've, the two of us actively get this. Now, when you go beyond that, in terms of profiling, you look at what is it that I have to say that nobody else is saying. That's where you start to build your thought leadership position. Saying the same thing as somebody else makes you into a parrot. Saying the same thing, saying not the same thing but something that needs to be said might make you a contrarian, but at least gives you some leverage in that conversation. Those are the kind of the two pieces of advice that I'd give, with a stronger focus on being the person who connects with people with each other, because that builds your influence tangibly, and ultimately it also puts you in a position to bridge larger groups of people with each other.
Oh, I think that's one of the best simple advice that I have received. Thank you. And I think that's really going to help our listeners. It's really about just taking the time to connect people and introduce. It widens the circle. And that's exactly what happened with us. I think it was Dennis Larson that said, you need to meet with Mike Klein.
Correct. Dennis Larson introduced the two of us, precisely.
Yes. And then
And now we're talking about Dennis.
And now we're talking.
Dennis is a good guy. He's a really smart guy. He's based in Oslo. Right. Real top strategic communication guy. Right. Very much worth connecting with.
Yeah, and we met each other, and it's very fascinating that you say that. I really like that. That's a great simple advice to do that doesn't make you feel like you're in sales.
No, because you're not selling anything. You're actually creating stuff.
Yeah, you are.
And you're creating a new reality around you as you do it.
Yeah, no, I get it. I really like that. So with all the craziness that's going on right now, and I'm not being facetious, but I really do believe it's kind of crazy right now. We're in kind of a revolution, like where suddenly America could become the enemy of Europe and vice versa. How do you navigate that kind of a day with your clients?
Well, first of all, I mean, there's the news cycle, which is a given day, but you don't navigate a day.
Right.
You navigate towards a destination. And that destination may be is generally an outcome that you're seeking, whether you're an organization or an individual or whomever. You're you and you're where you are, and you want to do something, be something, get somewhere. And so the issue is, what's the pathway to do that when the winds have changed, when the waves are roiling, when the deckhands are getting sick in the hold? How do you do that? And also, what's the most important thing? Is the most important thing getting your deckhands to feel less sick? Is it the most important thing reaching your objective by a certain day? Is the most important thing not having your ship get torn apart in the middle of the ocean? And that call is yours. It's either your call as a leader or it's your call as somebody who's on the ship. It's like, if you're on the ship and you're puking every day, do you want to stay on that ship? And we all have different ways of dealing with this. But I think the most important thing is we need to be honest about what our role is, what influence we actually have. And it's more than we think we have as a general rule. And whether, Our goal is just simply to survive until things become more predictable? Or do we want to achieve certain things in spite of, or perhaps be at at the benefit of that unpredictability?
Right.
I'm not opining about the political tone of the situation. I think there's opportunity in this, regardless of how you feel about the politics.
Oh, I would love for you, as we're coming to close, to talk about the opportunity that you see. I always like to end with a high.
Well, I think for people who are leaders, this is a time that requires leadership. And leadership isn't about just simply riding the wave of whatever the message is of the day. It's more like, to what extent are you willing to alter the course of your own situation, or of the community or organization that you're working in, regardless of whether you're the CEO or the chief communication officer, or whether you're somebody who is putting together the daily news digest. If you're putting together the daily news digest, the stuff that you decide to put in and not put into the daily news digest will make a difference in the way your people prioritize things. If you're a chief communication officer, the extent to which you're emphasizing priorities relative to other priorities, and the extent to which you have discretion to do that, that has an impact. If you're the chief communication officer and you've got a direct conversation with the CEO, the opportunity is to say, I see where there's benefit in aligning yourself with some trend, but you're going to antagonize this customer group or this employee group and destabilize them. Is that worth the risk of getting that headline? That's the kind of leadership that the current situation calls for, and we're capable of it and we're providing it. We just need to do it consciously.
I like that. That's a great ending there, Mike. So, if you look at your life, I always say, as you are a public figure and have been quite influential in our circle of communications, what would you like to see your legacy be?
I think, and it's funny because I'm actively building this legacy because I have two brands that I'm working on simultaneously. One is Strategic Magazine, which is emerging as a repository for great thought leadership in the communication space. And it's something that is turning the paradigm around away from what can we do for readers to what we can do for thought leaders to give them a place, a third party place where they can get their stuff published and then share it with additional credibility to the people they need to influence. I'd say having Strategic Magazine go on and continue to do that into the future, that would be a great half of my legacy. The other brand that I've created and that I'm building is something called We Lead Comms. And We Lead Comms, hashtag WELEADCOMMS.
Right, really
And We
come.
Lead Comms recognizes a communication leader every day for the courage, initiative, and leadership that we all bring to our jobs on a daily basis. That's also something that I'd like to continue. It's actually become the world's largest recognition program for communication professionals. And I created it literally with no money, with a list of 10 names, and with a hashtag and a LinkedIn company page. That now has 21,000 plus followers worldwide. I have sponsors, it's self supporting, and it continues to grow on a regular basis. If those two trends, which I've kind of pulled together into a single brand, into a single umbrella with both brands, just continuing those two things, even if I don't do anything else for the next 20 years, I would say that's a pretty good legacy.
That's a incredible legacy, Mike. Wow, I'm privileged to know you, and I've been observing you from the side, and I've loved our conversations, and I really want to thank you for coming on as kind of, for me, kind of showcasing there is still a role for us, which is good to know. In disruption, we need to be more strategic instead of less think that's a really good argument for all of us to say, and for you listeners that are not a communications person, actually having a practitioner that's gotten a master's degree, having gone through, learned about strategy is actually of value, which I really appreciate you saying. And then we'll put in the show notes where we can connect with you. And I just want to say thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Public Figure Society podcast, where innovation meets influence. If you love this episode, be sure to subscribe, follow, and leave a review. Connect with us on social media and join the conversation. Until next time, keep innovating, keep influencing, and we'll see you in the next episode.